Well, good evening everyone. We're in for a trip and a half tonight. If any of you have read the passage that we're going to cover, you'll be expecting that the next half an hour or so is going to be, well, to put it simply, rather heavy. And despite my best efforts to contextualize this whole topic within the larger framework of hope and grace that we find in 2 Peter, there is no way that I can avoid talking about the difficult issues that Peter raises for us here. There are things in these verses that we're going to have to look at tonight that in many ways scrape the very bottom of the barrel of human experience and depravity. There are issues which Peter deals with which may be largely uncomfortable for any of you who have endured these or things similar to them in the past. And so, as I've been preparing this week, I spent a lot of time in prayer asking God to help me with what I'm going to say tonight. I've asked Him to guide my words and to help me to faithfully teach something that I know in many ways I am far too young to deal with in a deeply mature way. And so I have to ask you up front to grant me grace as I go forward and to rely on the Spirit to take what I say and to make it much more significant than just my own reflections. Despite the darkness of this passage ahead, I think there is much that we can benefit from knowing about. And as we listen to Peter's teaching in this chapter, I hope you begin to see it too. So here goes. Let's start by reading 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 1 to 3 and then 10 to 22. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Many will follow in their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be maligned. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. And then further down, daring, self-willed, they do not tremble when they revile angelic majesties, whereas angels who are greater in might and power do not bring a reviling judgment against them before the Lord. But these, like unreasoning animals, born as creatures of instinct, to be captured and killed, reviling where they have no knowledge, will in the destruction of those creatures also be destroyed, suffering wrong as the wages of doing wrong. They count it a pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are stains and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions as they carouse with you, having eyes full of adultery that never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having a heart trained in greed, accursed children. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray, having followed the way of Balaam the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. But he received a rebuke for his own transgression. For a mute donkey, speaking with the voice of a man, restrained the madness of the prophet. These people are springs without water, and mists driven by a storm, for whom the blackness of darkness has been reserved. For speaking out of arrogant words of vanity, they entice by fleshly desires, by sensuality, those who barely escape from the ones who live in error, promising them freedom while they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. For if, after they have escaped the defilements of the world by the knowledge of the Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and are overcome, the last state has become worse for them than the first. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than to have known it and to turn away from the holy commandment handed to them. It has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to its own vomit, and a sow after washing, returns to wallowing in the mire. And, just in case any of you doubt it, I'll end this with the old benediction. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so the way I want to frame Peter's teaching in this passage tonight is through a consideration of what I've called the massive significance of a human life. I've divided my thoughts over the next few minutes into a number of containers which will each have a different sort of flavour as you listen. The first thing I want to do is give you a wide picture of our place in the structure of reality. Who are we as humans? What is our significance? Who else is out there? And where are we in relation to them? This part of our talk will be a little bit more technical and will draw from the whole of 2 Peter. And then we're going to take a turn and walk into the darkness of the world of the false teachers Peter is presenting us with in this passage. In this section, we're going to explore the kind of people that he's speaking about and reflect on what I have come to see as the good news of eternal damnation. Then, we will navigate our way back towards the light by considering how we might take Peter's advice and listen to the warnings that he has issued for us in this passage. In this part, we will think through what our responsibilities as Christians are in relation to these hard issues that he brings up. How can we stand up for all that is good and right and pure in the face of the reality that there are those out there, even today, who are willing to do anything in order to satisfy their lusts? That's where we're going. So let's get into it. First then, the technical bit. Who are we as humans? What is our significance? Who else is out there? And where are we in relation to these other beings? Well, as you read through 2 Peter, it becomes clear that humans are not the only beings in the universe. As far as I can see, there are 4 specific beings or groups of beings that Peter talks about in these short chapters. And it just so happens to be the case that these are pretty much the same 4 categories that we find laid out in the rest of scriptures as well. I'm going to give you the responsibility of reading this letter afterwards to find each of these references for yourself. And just now, I'm going to take the time to list them for you and to explore the ones that are more relevant here. At the head of all creation is God. Specifically in 2 Peter, the focus is on the second person of the Trinity. We as Christians have come to know God as the incarnate man who lived 2,000 years ago, Jesus. And through this letter, he is described as Saviour, as Lord, as Messiah. He is portrayed as good, as generous, as loving, and as the rightful master over all other beings that he created. He stands alone above all other people. He is God. We are not, and we should remember this. And then there are 3 other categories of people or beings that he has created mentioned throughout this letter. First, in order of power and authority under God, we have the angelic beings. And these beings are described in, a variety of ways. They are powerful, majestic. They influence our world in a way that we do not often see visibly, but they do sometimes directly interact with people, such as in Genesis chapter 6, and the story we looked at last week. And these beings are then split into 2 further categories. There are angels who submit to God as Lord, who follow his commandments and who know their place and role in the universe, happily existing within that role. And then there are the demonic rebels who have rejected God's kingship and set themselves up against Jesus. These rebels have been imprisoned in some sense, Peter tells us. They do not have full authority to do all that they wish to do. but they are still powerful, and they exert influence on our world in one shape or form. Peter recommends that we as humans should recognize the authority of these beings. We should show them the appropriate level of fear and live our lives in light of the reality of their destructive motivations towards those who submit to God. But we should not despair, because the current restraint of these beings is guarantee that they will not be allowed to run havoc and destroy God's people, and also it serves as a forepromise that God will one day banish these beings into utter destruction where they belong forever. And then the second creatures in order of power and authority under God in this universe are us, as human beings. We are the pinnacle of God's creation. But in the present, we are lower than angelic beings, fallen or obedient. Even so, we have been given a high place in this world. We have been granted eternal souls, and our actions have been given massive significance by God. We have been given a measure of responsibility in this world, and the character we are able to build now, well, it's going to last forever. We've been given dominion over the third category of being, the very bottom rung, which simply encompasses the animals of all different kinds, the dogs and pigs and cows and the like. But not all humans are outlined by Peter to be of the same value. In his letter, he identifies at least 3 states of being human. First, we have humans in their natural state, the way that we were born. And Peter actually doesn't talk an awful lot about humans in this state. His reference to them are normally in passing, and he normally only actually mentions them when he refers to Christians and what they were before they became believers. The most fundamental thing that he notes about humans in their natural state is that they are enslaved to lustful desire. The actions of anyone who lives in this state, natural state, is rather predictable. For though they think they are acting out of their own will, and they are in one sense, they will always choose to do what they most want. Natural people will always choose to follow the deepest desires of their hearts, and ultimately what they want is self-satisfaction and personal gain in whatever form that takes. There's lots of different ways this manifests. And Peter describes humans in their natural state as therefore being enslaved, as sinful and destined for the future of just judgment against their wrongful actions. But in reality, that's about all he says about unbelievers in this general sense. In this letter, he spends an awful lot of time on the other 2 categories of being human. The first of which is we, who have been saved through faith in Jesus. We have been granted the grace of sharing in God's own divine life by means of Jesus' actions on our behalf. Our relationship with God changes everything from this natural state. The life that has been born within us and the salvation that Jesus grants to us is wide-ranging and full of potential. Peter emphasizes that when we come to Jesus, we are freed from the enslavement to sinful desire that we were once trapped under. As we come to know who Jesus is and the significance of the other beings in this world, we are, enabled to accurately find our place in this order of reality. Those of us who are Christ's rightly see him as God and as Lord and Master over our lives. We see him for who he really is, and therefore we respond in appropriate submission, obedience, and love. We walk the path that Christ has set before us, this path of truth and righteousness, of progressive growth in character and virtue as his life flourishes within us over time. And at the same time, we are on guard for desires within us and influences without us which constantly seek to draw us away from our Saviour and into worthless, destructive behaviour. It's worth noting that Peter mentions that believers can be duped into participating in all different kinds of sin, even of a sexual nature, as he warns here. But that since we are Christ's, we will ultimately escape, even if it is by the skin of our teeth. Peter also highlights that we who are believers know the significance of the spiritual realm in both the positive and negative sense, and recognize the need to be wary of spiritual forces. We see our place above animals and our role in caring for and bringing order to this universe that God has put us in. We recognize his future plans for us to raise us up, to live forever in his kingdom as co-rulers who will then be described as peaceable, spotless, and blameless in all things. And this gives us real context for the kind of lives we want to live in the present. This category of human is eternally significant. The future of all those who have been given life through Christ is bright, and it is worth looking forward to. But now our message must head into the darkness, for the same cannot be said for the third category of human that Peter speaks about, and which our message is primarily referring to tonight. These people are those who have considered, understood, and then subsequently consciously rejected Jesus' authority and the path to life that he has set before them, choosing instead to go a different way, to follow the path to destruction. Other New Testament writers refer to people like this as apostates. They have at one time or another identified themselves as subjects of Christ and followers of his way. But now they have turned from that and have abandoned the life that was offered to them. They've stopped referring to him as their master and have run headlong into all that Jesus despises in this world. In doing this, they betray that they never knew Jesus in the first place, that they never had God's divine life within them, and that they were never free from enslavement to their desires, no matter how clean they may have appeared for a time. But this specific group that Peter is talking about, they're not just any old apostates. They are people who have deserted Christ for a specific and frankly horrific reason. They want to ravish his flock. These men and women are abusers, with sexual appetites that have prompted them to use a myriad of different tactics to try and manipulate true believers into joining them in their deviant activities. If you were here last week, you'll remember one of the tactics that these false teachers were using in order to try and accomplish their ends. They were teaching that Jesus was not going to return to this earth to judge human behavior, and that all of us are therefore free to participate in basically any activities that we want to. In summary, they were trying to ensure that no behavior was off limits, that anything that their greedy heart wanted to do was, well, according to them, fine and acceptable and open for even a believer to participate in. They preached freedom from moral responsibility. And this sounds a lot like the modern message of sexual freedom that we hear all about us today. But this was from within the church. And Peter informs us that the message these people offer in no way resembled true freedom. How, he asks us, can people who are themselves enslaved to every lust that enters their heart propose to offer freedom to other people? He says it's not those who say yes to every impulse they feel within them that are free. It is those who have the ability to say no to these impulses and yes to all that Christ has set before them on the path of righteousness. It is those people who are truly free. It is those who have taken their proper place in submission to the one and only true master of this universe, Jesus. It is them who have been granted freedom in this life. And as you read down through Peter's analysis of these people, it seems to be very strong and hard at first. But as you begin to pick up Peter's reasons for exposing the motivations of these false teachers, you realize that he's not actually exaggerating in the slightest. This specific group of people had allowed themselves to become so degraded that they could no longer look at anyone they came into contact with without seeing them as a potential sexual partner. And even worse, they were quite willing to target people who were new to the faith or weak in their faith, and to lure them away from the truth so that they could practice all kinds of sexual deviance with them. Just imagine the scene of this, of someone who comes to church with us and looks around at your husbands and wives, sons and daughters, friends or loved ones, and sees nothing more than an object for them to lust after. That is what these people were up to in the midst of these churches. They were disgusting people, and everything that Peter says about them, it's not an overstatement. He hits the real nail right on the head. Another interesting point that Peter highlights about these people is their arrogance in their analysis of their place in the order and authority of this universe. Not only do they reject God as head and master of their lives, but they also sneer at the possibility that there could be a spiritual realm of powers above them. I don't know exactly what Peter's referring to here, but he says that these people were willing to mock or revile the fallen demonic forces that even the good and faithful angels are unwilling to do. The ironic thing about this is that while these teachers are strutting around in this world, taking what they want with no fear of God or of angels or of anyone else, they are setting themselves up for a path that they will be unable to escape from. Rather than moving up in power and authority, they are actually preparing their own demotion and destruction. Peter can find no better analogies for the future of these people than to compare them to the lowest form of being in the structure of created beings. These people, although they think they are brilliant, have taken steps to demote themselves to the point of being an animal who can't think reasonably. He compares them specifically to three kinds of animals. To those like cows who have been bred for the single purpose of being killed, to dogs who eat vomit from the ground, and to pigs who, after being cleaned, go back and wallow in their own feces. Rather than moving up in the created order, as Paul tells us elsewhere, we as believers will do in the future. We will judge angels. These people are heading downwards as they make themselves nothing, worthless, and worthy only of judgment and destruction. To be frank, these people are despicable. And anyone who follows in their footsteps today is despicable as well. And as we consider these people and their end, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about why the things Peter tells us about here help us to understand one of the least attractive doctrines of the Christian faith just that little bit better. Here in this passage we begin to see, although in these extreme cases albeit, that hell is not such bad news after all. We see that the doctrine and the reality of future eternal destruction is good news for our universe. And I don't know about you, but I do not like the doctrine of hell that much. The idea that real humans, some of whom I have known personally in this life, will exist perpetually in conscious punishment and isolation from God's presence is uncomfortable, to say the least. We ask, isn't that a bit much? Isn't there another way? And the cold, hard answer we get back is no. There is no other way. Part of what it means to be human, and part of the honor that God has given us by being stamped in His image is this: what we do with our lives and the choices we make will be eternally respected by God. if we choose to kill and destroy, when we had open to us the opportunity of a life of obedience and faith towards the God who created us, and if we choose to reject him and declare that we're, well, frankly, wanting to live in a universe without him, and according to our own rules, not his, the terrifying reality is this: God's going to take our desires seriously. God honors us as human beings in giving us what we want. And the sad reality is that those who reject Christ now will never support him in his future kingdom either. And so they must be removed from the picture entirely and given what their actions in this world have earned for them. And that last little bit of that statement, I think, is massively important when I come to think about final judgment. I think that in the past, when I have been terrified of the reality of hell and final judgment, it was because I didn't really understand the kind of God that we serve. I didn't let his goodness and fairness wash through my soul as it does just that little bit more now. God is a God of justice. He will never give anyone what they do not deserve. We can be absolutely confident of this. Even if we don't fully understand it, believe it. We can be totally confident that God will give each and every individual who stands before him as a judge a fair and real opportunity to submit to him as Lord and Master during their life here on earth. We are not privy to how God does this in the lives of those who have never heard the gospel or understood it properly. But he will be fair for these too. And though this is a fact, it does not change us in our mandate that we must go as far and wide as we can and spread the message of the gospel. But I think that it is easy to argue from Scripture that not a single person will stand before God who has not been given sufficient light or opportunity to seek him, to find him, and to submit to his authority as a good and loving Father in this life. In some sense, what I've just said is on my behalf an act of faith. I don't know how God will show himself to be just and to have given light to every human who has ever lived, but even if I don't understand, I think that this fact is well founded in the character of the God who I know personally. And so because of the fact that God will never judge someone unfairly, we must also face up to the fact that what God does in judgment is actually the best thing that could ever happen to those who reject him. He is honoring the position that he has given them, and the choices that they have made in life. He is honoring those too. This is hard news, but it is good news at the same time. As we look around this broken world, filled with rebels who shake their fists at God, the God who we love, and who loves both us and them even more, we can be sure that this is not going to be the world we live in forever. Rebels will not roam around in God's universe forever. They will not bring disorder and destruction to this good and prosperous kingdom much longer. And for Peter, this is specifically good news, because the people who have come into the churches he is writing to are destined to receive justice. They have wreaked havoc, and they plan to do so for as long as they can get away with it. But while people like this are a reality in this life, their reign is only temporary, and they will be destroyed in the future along with all other rebellious creatures, whether it be human or angelic. And just to enforce this fact, that the future judgment will be just, Peter summarized it like this: those who have done wrong will be paid back with wrong. He uses the analogy that we're all aware of wages to illustrate the justice of God's future judgment. When we go out to work, or more accurately for some of us at the moment, when we go to the spare room to work, we will be paid at the end of the month for what we have done for our employer. We will get what we deserve based on the work that we have put in. And so too, Peter imagines our lives as a kind of workplace. We are God's workers for good in this world. He has made us in his image, placed us above the animals and over the earth, and told us to be fruitful, multiply, and to bring order to all that is around us. And when we do this, as energized by the divine life that chapter 1 explains for us, God will honor us because we do this. But when people use the high calling of human life to serve themselves, to manipulate and to use others for their own satisfaction, never caring about the destruction that they cause, well, they will be given what they deserve. They will be paid exactly what they have earned for themselves. And so, as we bring this heavy teaching to a close, there are several things that we need to consider for applying this to our own lives. Peter provides us here with a stark warning to be vigilant, to watch out for people like this who then and now seek to satisfy their corrupt hearts through abuse, manipulation, and false teaching. There are people alive today, and some of them, terrifyingly, maybe closer than any of us would like to think, that seek to abuse those that are in their sphere of influence for their own satisfaction. Now, I'm not going to say an awful lot about this because I'm simply not qualified to. But in preparation for this message, I read a number of survivor stories of men and women who were abused by trusted members of their churches. And these stories were not pretty. In many ways, I'd rather have gone without reading. But there are some things that you simply can only ever feel the weight of when you hear them coming from the mouths of people who've experienced those things firsthand. Rachel Den Hollander is a wonderful example of a Christian who I think you should go and listen to on this subject. She was sexually abused by a paedophile in her church, in her Sunday school, when she was a young child. And then later on in life, she was also abused by the serial sexual abuser Larry Nassar, who some of you may have heard about on the news. And the main feeling I got when I was listening to her talks and reading her words in a book that I read about her abuse was this: we as a church need to do all we can to ensure this never happens to any of the little children who are in our care. And we need to do all we can to wisely assume that some of us have been, or right now are being, the recipients of this kind of behaviour. And if you are, or if you have been a victim of sexual assault, well, know this: the God who created this universe and who has given infinite value to every one of his children, he loves you more dearly than you can ever imagine. And he will bring real justice against anyone who has done this to you. My heart breaks for you. You need to talk to someone about this. Do not let these monsters get away with what they are doing any longer. For sin and abuse festers and grows in the darkness, but it dies in the light. And to the rest of us, let's be the kind of gracious, wise, and trustworthy people who someone could confide in if they needed to. Let us not be hard, or judgmental, or religious. Let us not take the safety measures that are in place lightly, or see them as a burden. Child safety policies and police background checks are important, so let's make sure we don't fill them out simply as a formality. Keep these verses in mind the next time you have to do one. The risk is real. And then, if any of us are told about abuse, and yes, it is possible we will be, well, let's not hide it for any reason. Christ's church does not need us to protect it from scandal, but his children, both young and old, do need protected from abusers. There's so much more that needs to be said here, but I simply am not qualified to say it. And so if you want to hear more, go and listen to the talk by Rachel Den Hollander, which I will put in the group later. And so, to wrap this all up, Let these stark verses remind us about the massive significance of every human life. What we do with these bodies, with our minds, with our actions, will matter forever. The choices we make today determine whether we walk the path to death or to life. They determine whether we bring flourishing to this world and build character that will last forever happily in God's eternal kingdom of peace and prosperity, or whether we will destroy and tear God's own children down, so that the only option you give him is to turn you over eternally to what you deserve, to pay you with what you have earned for yourself. So what will we do? Well, let's take Peter's advice and lean hard in Christ, make the most of the life he has given us, and put our all into supplementing our faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness, and steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love for our God and for our neighbours. Let us pursue him and all that it means to be his, with hearts that love him and love the people he died to save. Amen.